Ancient Sumerian grammar. The final person prefix within the verbal chain. The final person prefix is labelled as such because it's always the last prefix that comes just before the verbal root. And it can be expressed in terms of the subject, the oblique object, or the indirect object, depending on context. In transitive perfective forms, we see it expressed as the subject, as in this example. So in this example, we see it right here next to the verbal root, meaning to slaughter, and we see it expressed as n. N represents the third person. I'll show you the other forms in a second, and it's cross-referencing lugau, or cross-referencing king, which is marked in the ergative marker because it's a transitive verb. Okay, right, so here we see it cross-referencing the subject. But in the full English translation, it doesn't really have a function. It gets lost in translation. And so this is the exact reason why I like to do a direct translation before the full translation, because otherwise it can get quite confusing for an English-speaking person. For something that exists in Sumerian, but we don't say it when we translate it to English, is a bit of a headfuck. And there's a lot of this in Sumerian, and it could get very confusing. So I like to have a translation where it's as direct as possible so we can understand what says what and why it says what it says. For instance, my direct translation here would be, the king, he slaughtered them. And I just think that really helps to know what says what translates as what. Do you know what I mean? Don't you find that is a lot easier than the final translation here, where it's left out the independent pronoun third person he, and it just says the king slaughtered them, and it's just a little bit confusing. So I think the direct translation helps. But this is Sumerian, and there are some frustrating and confusing nuances that you just have to put up with and learn. And two of them actually exist in this sentence. That's the vocalic prefix e and the direct object on the end, which is in the third person non-human, and it's marked by the zeromorph, translated as them. When the direct object is in the person of an independent pronoun, we can see it suffixed, as shown here with the zeromorph, and it can take these forms. And the way you tell the difference between the first and second, and then again between the third human and the third non-human, is context. So it's very simple. If I wanted to change the sentence to the king slaughtered you, I would get rid of the zeromorph here, and I would place in the morpheme n, which would look like this. And I just change everything accordingly. The king slaughtered you, or the king, he slaughtered you. And you would change the inflection as desired, depending on the person. So that is how you mark the direct object of a transitive perfective verb if the direct object is a person. If you need reminding, the direct object receives the action of the verb. In these examples, it was obviously the king slaughtered you, or the king slaughtered them. Slaughtered obviously being the verb, and you and them being the direct object in the person form. So this rule, where it's suffixed on the end, is only with pronouns. But if the direct object is inanimate or even animate but referring to a specific name or deity, it goes back to the subject, object, verb, word order. Like in this example, subject, object, verb, literally it says, the king to Enlil said to him. The king said to Enlil. The king obviously being the subject, and Enlil obviously being the direct object. Alright, so I'm going to conclude this video here. So we briefly touched on the final person prefix, and then as I was making that, I realized that I needed to explain the direct object a little bit before I moved on to talk about the positions of the oblique object and the indirect object of the final person to continue. So I will go into the oblique object and the indirect object in the next video.